So I have the pleasure of introducing our lecturer tonight. Lecturer tonight is from Portland State University, hopefully the start of an exchange or relationship in terms of having lecturers back and forth between the schools to build a culture of that. Lecturer is B.D. Wortham-Galvin, and I'll introduce, I know she does work in two areas, she explained, in urban design and community design, sometimes in one, sometimes in the other, and sometimes with an overlap. So let me just read some of her bio, give you a background. So B.D. is an assistant professor of design humanities at Portland State University. She has a PhD in history and theory of architecture from MIT. She has a master's degree in historic preservation from UPenn, and a master's degree from Maryland as well. A recent focus is on how theories of cultural sustainability in the everyday can be applied to design and stewardship of an adaptable built environment. She brings to PSU her non-profit organization, Urban Dialogues, Inc., which won the 2009 Understanding Project of the Year Award from the Heart of Chesapeake Country Heritage Area Program for its community design work on the Maryland's Eastern Shore. She is currently working in the neighborhoods of Rosewood and Park Rose and the Willamette West chapter for Humanity. She recently published a book chapter, Making the Familiar Strange, Understanding Design Practice as Cultural Practice, in the book, The Urban Wisdom of Jane Jacobs. She's also part, I spoke about, a new Center for Public Interest in Design with Sergio Palaroni out of PSU. Some of you may be familiar with this. I know some of our students in Portland and Whiteside campus are involved in this as well, and some activities there. So without further ado, let's welcome Dee.
So in addition to teaching design studios, I'm also the resident historian for PSU's faculty, and so we just started the term. It's that big history survey. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the type. And usually I start out by saying, okay, when I say we're studying architecture this term, what are we going to be studying? And students raise their hand and they say buildings, and I said absolutely right. And then they say other things, but really it's always a variant of buildings. And I said, all of this is true. I said, but architecture is not just about buildings. Architecture is also about people. And so that's the frame with which I'm going to talk about this evening. And you notice the real title's at the bottom, or the official title, but at the top it's really the question, what happens when we make little plans? Sorry, Daniel Burnham, his famous quote, which everyone always thinks is small plans, but it's actually make no little plans. And so part of this comes out of an interest from the urban scale and how people are interacting with their own environments. This past summer, Architect Magazine featured an article that they called The Newest Urbanism. And obviously they're doing a play on the new urbanism, trying to figure out what movement is going to supplant that particular effort. And in their narrative, they were rooting the new emergence of urban design. In 2005, a firm called Rebar in San Francisco turned a small parking space into a small park. And it's part of an effort that we now know as Parking Day. The way in which the article went on to define what they called tactical urbanism was, quote, temporary, cheap, and usually grassroots interventions, including so-called guerrilla gardens, pop-up parks, food carts, and open streets projects that are all designed to improve city life on a block-by-block, street-by-street basis. And the article goes on to claim also that this has really emerged just in the past decade, and that it's fairly intense. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to sort of contextualize it from a frame that I understand it at a more superficial level, talk about some of those examples, and then deeply go into a student-engaged project that happened this past fall. So while architect used the term tactical, many people have their own phrases. I'm obviously calling it contingent urbanism, but other terms like participatory, open source, pop-up, DIY, city repair, guerrilla urbanism, these are all the terms being used to describe these activities. The reason why I call it contingent is not just to be ornery and different, but what I like about the term contingent is its dual meaning, that contingent is situated in a particular circumstance, but contingent also means a group of people with some common shared value. And so for me, that actually underlies or describes this activity more accurately than these other terms. What all of these terms have in common are how regular people are engaged in making place. The Tactical Urbanism Manual, which you can download online if you Google it, there's a PDF that was done by a group called Street Plans Collaborative. This is their official definition. And they talk about these things, they don't have to have all these characteristics, but they have at least some of them. That it's usually a deliberate, phased approach to instigating change. That it's always situated in the local ideas for local challenges. Short-term commitments, often very temporary. Realistic expectations, low risk, unless we talk about the illegal, which we will in a second. So obviously the risk there is being arrested. But the possibility of high reward. So, so when I say architecture is about people, one of the things that interests me about contingent urbanism is that it's really about social capital. And the social capital between regular people and then people who are at the more organizational capacity, whether that's the city or architecture firms or planning agencies, how are those groups coming together? So what you have here is a selective contingent urbanism timeline. And before I sort of take you through it, I want to sort of read to you some of the questions that are bouncing around in my head about this particular topic. Right? So what is it that we can learn about these acts of the everyday and not so everyday resistance? What do they reveal about the limitations and possibilities that are embedded in our public realm in the contemporary city? How does contingent urbanism, how do these instances of insurgency challenge the conventional understanding of how we make public spaces? And how are these public spaces and activities redefining and expanding the roles, functions, and even meaning of the public and production of space? So the items on this timeline, again, it's a selected, edited one, begin to hint at them. But one of the things you really notice is that this activity really takes off in the 21st century. And it is happening globally, although a lot of it is really embedded in North America in a variety of efforts. But I do want to I'll point out a couple of them because they're going to come back, one of them immediately. But one of them, 1970, San Francisco artist Bonnie Ora Shirk introduces Portable Architecture Project. All right, so we're going to hit that in a couple of slides. But when I move on to the next slide, I just want to highlight in 1914, New York City launched. We think of it now as an open streets, or that's the moniker used for it, but at the time it was called the Play Streets program because it was particularly focused on kids, that there weren't enough spaces at the turn. Because remember, turn of the 20th century, we have kids working in factories, if you think of the historical context. So they started to close down very specific streets so that when these kids weren't working in factories, they would actually have a place to be children, to engage and play. It was very successful. That program continues on today, although it's transformed into open streets. And while it would happen for small amounts of time, about 100 years ago, now whole neighborhoods can apply for a street to be closed down for the whole summer so that kids can enjoy that particular activity. Notice that it spreads to England in 1950, and then in Seattle it comes to the Pacific Northwest in 1965, and now it's been brought into open streets, that it's not just about children and play, but potentially other activities as well. So this is what we know them as, right? Here we are in Times Square, that we will close down streets as open streets for celebration, consumption of food, rituals, entertainment. In Japan, they're actually called pedestrian heavens, which I like that term better than open streets. Open streets sounds a little bit more like a planning sort of bureaucratic term. And so this is one of the ways, I think, in which most people understand contingent urbanism. In making the case that this is really a 21st century activity, right, when I referenced the Architect magazine saying, well, this supplant new urbanism is the next major urban design movement, you can notice in this mapping that just in terms of places that were engaging actively in open streets programs, in 2005, right, it's pretty scant, although it's happening. Look by 2011, that you're hitting both coasts as well as sort of the middle, the south. It's only 6 years, which in terms of architecture and building time, right, is nothing. One single building can be constructed in that time period, and yet here we have this activity that is moving all over the nation. Having said that, and having referenced the article which really characterized this as a 21st century movement, this is the historian in me. It didn't start in the 21st century. It didn't even start with the play streets in 1914. One of the earliest examples that we can point to from a European perspective is the Les Bouquinistes in Paris. So if we go back to the 16th century, in the 1500s, traveling booksellers were setting up primarily along the Seine. The reason why you would think of this as a significant activity is, remember, two major things have happened. We've had the printing press, so now books are not transcribed by hand, right, but they can be produced en masse, and so they can be disseminated to larger amounts of people. We're moving from an oral society, right, to one that reads. But the second thing is we still don't really have libraries. It's not a typology in the way that we understand it as the public library that anybody has access to. Libraries at this point are private. They are embedded either in monks and monasteries for their education and engagement, or they're with the elite and the aristocracy. Now, we do have Oxford and some places in England starting to open up their universities, and the university now exists as an institution, but again, their libraries were not open to everyone. So Les Bouquinistes are interesting because as we move through this trajectory, we also have the emergence of the middle class, right? We have people moving out of agrarian fuel paradigms into cities and urbanization. And we have this moment where they're trying to get books into the hands of people, but in a tactical way, right? They're doing it on the streets. This was not popular. So if you look at this, again, this is a little bit of a selected timeline, but until we hit the 19th century, so from the 16th century to the 19th century, they're consistently being banned and declared, and their activities being declared illegal and arrested, and they continue to pop back up because there's clearly a voracious demand for this literature, which is a little bit, if you guys read Richard Said It, part of this emergence of a public sphere to begin with, right? Cafes, coffee shops, and the dissemination and discussion of literature itself. So the Bouquinistes from the 16th to 19th century, they're illegal, they're trying to sell books on the street. It's considered an unsanctioned activity, but they persist until we get to 1859, when finally they are allowed. It becomes a regulated activity, so the city issues permits, as all good cities do when they want to make something legal and official. They designate very specific points where they can actually engage in this street activity. If you look further down, it becomes even more codified because by the 1930s, the size of their box is determined, and you're like, their box, what do they do with their box? Well, you can imagine, I mean, all of us have books, they're very heavy, we lug them around. And you can see this is the contemporary boxes. So they wanted to be able to leave their books behind so that every night when they set up, right, they can leave their supplies behind, go home, come back in the morning, and set up again. By 1993, there's a new law standardizing the new box size, which is what you see in the image here. By 2007, UNESCO declares the Bouquinistes part of the Seine as a World Heritage Site. So in the description, when they're sort of talking about the Seine in this part of downtown Paris as a significant cultural site, one of the things they point to in justifying their decision are the Bouquinistes. We get to 2012, some stats, 300,000 books are sold on an annual basis from 900 boxes by 240 sellers along sort of 3 kilometers of the Seine. So why am I sort of interested in this other than it's sort of neat and interesting sort of way to talk about the politicization of public space as well as sort of regular people laying claim to the city? Part of it is the trajectory of contingent urbanism, which usually starts, I realize that some of this stuff up here is pale, so I'll let you know what it is. But it usually starts not with official groups. So it's in the pale green up here, but I have some of the tacticians are local activists, community groups, artists, regular citizens. And then as you get to the darker green, you get more official entities. All right? And then when you look at the activities, which I'm going to talk about in a second, there's sort of the same trajectory. The lighter stuff is the stuff that's unsanctioned and illegal, and it's moving to things that then become part of the regulatory process. So the Bouquinistes are interesting to me because it starts as an activity in the 16th century, but by the 21st, it has become regulated, codified, and by the world, UNESCO, as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, right? So something that started as a very tactical activity now becomes official, right? And there's a journey onto that. And I think that journey is interesting because I'm not valuing that journey as completely good. I think when you move to that other end, then you may be compromising some of the initial intent of that. So if you look at what you can read on this particular list, so I've listed the tacticians. So this isn't just about activists and everyday people, as I've noted that it moves all the way through, businesses, entrepreneurs, architects' offices, until you get sort of the city laying out a regulatory system for these activities. And the activities themselves usually start in the unsanctioned or the illegal. Some of the things that are listed there that I'm going to show you if you're not familiar with these terms: ad bombing, chair busting, dead drops, Lego bombing, although I'm not going to show you that one, but Lego bombing is interesting. It's when the infrastructure of buildings starts to come apart. People come by with Legos and rebuild what has fallen apart because it's sort of the commentary on who cares about this infrastructure. And then as these things start to become accepted, right, we move into things that you can not only read, but that you're probably more familiar with from mobile vendors, parking day, pop-ups, right, until the most codified like food carts, street fairs, play streets, and open streets that I mentioned before. Before I move forward, so I'm going to talk about some of these things so you can see some images so they stick in your brain. I do want to read a quote from the former mayor of Curitiba, Brazil, who also happened to be an architect. His name is Jaime Lerner, and he says, and this is sort of my response to Daniel Burnham's, or my response, his response that I'm quoting as a frame to Daniel Burnham's Make No Little Plans, in the context of the City Beautiful movement. The lack of resources is no longer an excuse not to act. The idea that actions should only be taken after all of the answers and the resources have been found is a sure recipe for paralysis. The design and planning of a city is a process that allows for corrections, that needs corrections. It is supremely arrogant to believe that planning and design can be done only after every possible variable has already been controlled. All right, so that's sort of the counterpoint to that. So what are some of these activities that were on the chart? I'm going to start with the sort of most unsanctioned and illegal. A lot of the things that fall into this category really come out of people engaging with issues of neglect. They notice neglect and they're trying to highlight it, sometimes just highlight it, sometimes ameliorate it. And in the cases that you're seeing here of weed and chair bombing, these are cases that are really about either maintaining or even providing a public infrastructure that's missing. So the gentleman in Miami who does the weed bombing, so what he's doing is, noticing all of the landscape that is surviving on its own, right, weeds. And he goes through with his spray paint, right, this is his version of graffiti, and he highlights them so that he makes it very clear the areas of neglect in terms of the landscape of the city, whether it was planned landscape or whether it's things just trying to emerge in of themselves. Chair bombing, you can see it's sort of a creative, in this case, a creative reuse of pallets, which is this particular neighborhood in Brooklyn had a lack of any street furniture or infrastructure or places to sit or engage in the public realm, which part of it's about building social capital in the public realm. But for those of you who either have had little ones or the elders of your family, you also start to realize that both of those groups like to be able to sit every once in a while when you're going for a walk, right? That's sort of a necessary activity. And so chair bombing is just about providing chairs in neighborhoods where there is no street infrastructure, and that people are allowed to move them wherever they want, right? Where they see the need happening. Again, we're still more in these either illegal or unsanctioned modes where people are questioning standard modes of operation. One of the phrases I use to describe this activity is making the familiar strange. Sometimes people use the term creative repurposing. So up here we have what's called dead drops. So this is a way, and particularly interesting given all the stuff that's come out of the NSA, this predates it, but it was a way of file sharing offline and or providing an ability for people to acquire data who don't have access to the internet. So what they do is they put they go into primarily brick. You've got to love old buildings because they give us that mortar joint. They go and they take out some of the mortar and they put in flash sticks or cases to house the flash sticks. So, sometimes there's the receiver end and you can pull the flash stick in and out. And this has become a really tactical way of sharing information offline, right? If you don't want Big Brother to know what you're talking about. but also to give people access to these things. And they first started in New York City, but they're actually showing up globally. But again, what's interesting about this is it's new meet old. It's happening in historic infrastructure because, right, our friend the mortar joint is providing that area of opportunity. In the bottom right, you can see what's called ad busting, which is looking at the infrastructure of billboards, particularly older ones, that came out of post-World War II era throughout the 20th century. And they're trying to repurpose these. These are usually activists who are pushing against consumer culture, globalization, some of those ideas. So this one in Miami is where they turned that structure into a playground. Here, if you're familiar with the work of Candy Chang, this is her I Wish This Was project, which she started in the Gulf Coast following Hurricane Katrina, but it's moved to other places like Detroit, particularly where there's a tremendous amount of disinvestment and abandonment. And she's trying to push on the notion of a public meeting. Who goes to public meetings? Do people who have to hold 2 or 3 jobs go to public meetings? Do people who don't have English as their first language go to public meetings, right? So that public meetings where people get to comment on the design or stewardship of their built environment are still very much socioeconomically based for the middle classes and above. But if we're talking about people who don't speak English or don't speak English well or just have to hold down 2 or 3 jobs to survive, their ability to go to a public meeting has been compromised. So she was trying to figure out a way, can we put the public meeting back into the neighborhoods and find out what people really want to have happen with these places. So, this is the illegal part of it, right? She boarded up buildings or spaces. She posts these stickers blank. And then she starts to document what people start to write about what they want to see happen in their neighborhoods. Guerrilla gardening and rewilding. This is from the same day event. It happened in Portland. These are actually bicycle activists who were going around trying to poke at the mythology of Portland as one of the most sustainable cities, trying to say, well, how sustainable is it really? One of the things they did is find a bunch of parking lots where obviously nature is trying to find its way back in, and they were trying to assist nature in that activity by breaking up the asphalt. Again, we're sort of in the unsanctioned realm. But the other thing they did, this is I-5, farther up north. They were going to these no-man lands that we're very familiar with now in our automobile landscape, right? These landscapes in between off-ramps and highways. And they planted, and they are taking care of what they have called the Jane Jacobs Community Garden. Because who really has access to this, but trying to sort of make the point of why is the city, which is celebrated for its sustainability, still ultimately an automobile-oriented landscape. Here we have, we're looking at 2 community gardens, one in Vancouver, BC, the other one in Seattle. This is where we're starting to move more into those hybrid activities or hybrid categories, because obviously at this point these are sanctioned activities, they're allowed to happen. The Hastings Urban Farm I find interesting because it had a series of tactical contingent activities on them before it landed here. It started as a protest tent city during the Olympics for the homeless, right, when that was held there. Then it was converted into a site for a homeless soccer league. And now it has become this urban farm, the food primarily going to a homeless shelter to help feed that population. And there are current plans to develop some affordable housing on the site as well. So this is what I'm talking about. We're moving into the more official, the more allowed. And then same thing here. It started this is the top floor of a parking garage. It started in this neighborhood of Seattle where there's very little open space. Neighbors who lived around it started tactically just putting their potted, their little herb garden, very sort of small things on the edges or in those weird spaces that are painted that you can't park in, right, because 2 people have to back out. And then based on that tactical intervention, they actually got permission from the city and leveraged with the developer or owner of this particular parking garage to turn it into a community garden for all of the people living there. Pop-up town halls. Again, we're moving into more sort of official or moneyed groups doing this type of activity. This was actually a collaboration between BMW and Guggenheim. It was called the BMW Guggenheim Lab. The intention originally was that they would go into cities globally, find vacant spaces like you see here, put up a pop-up town hall, and then any community group could apply to use this space for their need. The plan was that they would spend 3 months in every city, that they would sort of map what was happening, They started in Manhattan's East Village. It also went to Berlin and Mumbai. It attracted, when it was in East Village, it attracted about 54,000 visitors during its 3 months that it was there in terms of people tactically using it. Interestingly enough, though, and I haven't done enough research to find out why, if you notice this last date right here, this activity was supposed to happen through 2016 and supposed to run through about a dozen cities, and they ceased operations this summer. And I have no idea why, but I will definitely be finding that out because that's sort of interesting to me. Why is that happening? Pre-vitalization is another way in which more official entities are doing contingent urbanism. In this case, often an owner of a site that is vacant. It's not just that the site is vacant, but often the neighborhood itself doesn't have a lot of activity or people. So in this case, he hired the firm Envelope A&D, as it's called Proxy SF in San Francisco. And what's up there, right, our friend the shipping container. So it's got a pop-up retail, cafe, bar, and urban garden, because they're just trying to get activity happening on the site. And it's temporary. But this is being used sort of all over as a way to attract people to site, to revitalize an area so that then more physical built projects can enter when the financing is available. In our creative reuse of infrastructure, instead of getting rid of things, or in this case, John Locke was dismayed that sort of everything that was abandoned was being turned into an advertising opportunity, right, for global commerce. So we started looking at old phone booths. Everybody's got their cell phones, right? And turning them into mini libraries so that people might have access to books. And it's sort of, if you take one, then you have to leave one type of scenario. Or in this case, here we are in New Zealand over here. And I'm sure I don't know Eugene that well, but I would eventually have this issue. We certainly have it in Portland in the far east neighborhoods, which are bus stops with no bus stop infrastructure, right? And so people are standing in the rain waiting. This particular pop-up became called Stairway Cinema, so it's not just a place to wait out of the rain, but actually what they show, so it's being projected from this top onto this wall, are little mini movies. So no commercials allowed, so that you actually have something to do while you're waiting for the bus. This one's in Manhattan. It's called Soft Walks, and it tries to do with the ubiquity of scaffolding when construction projects are underway, and trying to think about how can we turn that into an opportunity to create public space, and not only create it, but ways in which people want. So with Softwalks, what you do is you buy a kit of parts. It started actually as a Kickstarter campaign. They include a seat, which you can see shown. It also has a counter, which would be more like bar height counter. Planters, decorative light covers. And so you can install whatever you need, and they all clamp onto scaffolding, so that you can make a little public realm wherever you are during that project's life, right, while that scaffolding is up. To start to take something that we normally think of as, when we see it, into the public realm. All right, so here we are at Parking Day, and this is what I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about, because we sort of went through the others fairly quickly. As I mentioned on that timeline, it starts in 1970 with an artist. And what Bonnie does is, obviously you can see it here, right? Put down some sod, some picnic benches, and was just trying to make a commentary on, this is actually technically a public right-of-way, but it's currently used just for parking. And is that the appropriate use of that particular site and space? And when we move back to 2005 and Rebar doing the same thing, we get the proliferation of what we now know as Parking Day, which are more temporary reclamation of parking spaces. So if this was prompted in 2005 by Rebar, again, 6 years later, by 2011, there had been, I'm going to give you some stats here, that's why I got to look at this, 975 reclaimed parking spaces, meaning temporarily reclaimed, in 35 different countries across 6 continents, within 5 years of this activity re-emerging. And this is a huge issue because usually we're talking about public rights of way. We think of them as parking spaces, but think about who owns that land. Usually it's this, I'm not talking about sort of suburban strip malls, but if you're in the city owns that land. And so can we start to think about reappropriating it back for public use? Parking Day, which is temporary, right, happens on a day when people engage these things, has now sponsored, this is where we're moving on our trajectory, right, from the most unsanctioned, which was Bonnie's illegal art project, right, her performance art piece, into things that start to become a hybrid because we say, okay, for a day, we'll let you do what you want with these parking spaces. Now in cities, San Francisco, LA, Portland, Seattle, now all have sanctioned programs for these activities, and now they call them parklets. And you can see some examples up here. Most of them are permanent. I find this one interesting in San Francisco because actually it's a mobile one, meaning it'll stay in a neighborhood anywhere between a week and 2 weeks and then move to another neighborhood that doesn't have parks. Primarily in the Yerba Buena district is where it seems to be circulating around. So this one does move. Some of them are permanent. And there is now a whole regulatory process behind this application. When it was being considered in Seattle, so you can see here, I'm capturing from a blog, coming to Seattle in 2013. So in 2012, when they realized there was going to be now a regulatory system by which you could design and create a parklet and make that infrastructure permanent, there were some people from the design realm and from the activist realm who started blogging about this and were worried about it. And why were they worried about it? Well, if we back up a little bit, you can sort of see up here, there's some temporary seating. What has happened when these things become codified and regulated is that they are actually becoming privatized, meaning a coffee shop will decide to have a parklet. So they'll put tables and chairs out there, but when the shop is closed, the tables and chairs go away. And so then what you have is basically an empty platform. So if we're talking about this, when it started, it was about reclaiming parking spots for people, right? This issue of public space. But now that it has a whole regulatory system behind it, the people who can afford that are people with money, private businesses. And so what happens if you look back at this, right? You can see keep it public, consider permanent seating, and not all parklets are created equal on these sort of headers. This is the discourse that was happening in Seattle prior to the establishment of the regulations, which is we're concerned it's going to be all restaurants and cafes, putting out just a platform in the parking space, and then just using it to extend their outside seating, and then that seating and that infrastructure will go away when that cafe or restaurant is closed. Right? So if all of a sudden the seating, and so that's the public versus private, and also, if the seating is made permanent, now it's an infrastructure that we can use even when your restaurant is closed or your cafe is closed. That helps make it public, and sort of not all are created equal is getting to this discourse, this point of, we had these things that started from an unsanctioned point of view about reclaiming public rights of way for people, and now they moved into another way for, the sort of consumer global culture to move out into the street. So having said all of that, in the fall term, it was not a studio, it was actually a seminar. I had students partner with the SOMA Eco District, and SOMA just means South of Market, and everybody's got to be hip like New York. And it's in Portland, and you're probably familiar with the Eco District neighborhood phenomenon. So what I'm going to do is run through the three main designs that came out of this particular seminar, and then talk about not just what happened that fall, but what has happened since then. So if you're not familiar with Portland, this is a significant portion of the SOMA district, but not all of it. This is South Park Blocks. This is PSU's campus right here. The river would be over here. And you can see here in purple are going to be the sites. This blue bar represents a food cart pod. SOMA district itself, so this is Market, is everything south of Market, but all the way to, there's 405 highway here, which actually curves around until it hits 5. And then it goes all the way to NATO Parkway, which basically runs parallel to the Willamette. So that's sort of the district they were looking at. And I should mention that the SOMA Eco District, that committee is primarily run by business leaders. And they were interested in this more as a way of extending their own business when we initially partnered with them. So if we look at the one at the top here, in the plan, so this is an apartment building, and that's multi-storied. I forget how tall, it's like, I think 6 stories. But the ground floor has coffee shops, pizza schmizza, those types of things. And then over here are just, retail, restaurant, that type of thing. And so what the students actually proposed, there were 2 groups, we're putting them around the corner. The location in part was not only to satisfy the business owners, but also to make an extension with Halpern Blocks, which is a series of public spaces running through Southwood Market. And they wanted to make a more explicit connection to it because this part of the Halpern landscape design is actually quite underutilized. If you look at the perspectives when they're proposing here, one of the key elements for them, because of Portland's climate, was to provide shelter through these polycarbonate panels, and so that these could be occupied during light rain, right, particularly in the winter months. But one of the things that I'm going to show you a night shot that they focused on was embedding projectors in the base so that you could both light up the sidewalk but also light up the panels so that it would encourage night culture, or in the case of winter, people are already out right at 4:30 and 5, but it's dark. So that was sort of part of the main structure. The canopy structure also had a relationship to what you will see in the back, series of landscaping. This was about stormwater runoff and rainwater management. Here's the night shot, right? So you can start to see some of their ideas about lighting up this area of Soma, which once it becomes dark, doesn't feel very safe as a pedestrian. So they would not only be lighting the parklet itself, but also major pedestrian places like crosswalks. I think I'll skip over this one. So they were also asked to deal with what are the major materials that you're using, how and why are you using them. All right, so the other two parklets were down here supporting this food cart pod, which this is I forget who, but it's a bank. It's not Bank of America, it's not Wells Fargo, it's somebody. And then the rest of that lot is parking and then food carts. And so there's this, here's PARKLETS. This is all PSU, but this is also the engineering buildings and other city infrastructure. Records and permitting are over here. So there's huge lunch crowds that go to these and then disperse and leave, right, because you sort of have no place to eat your lunch. So they were trying to sort of address look, we already have people coming to this place, but instead of letting them flee, can we figure out a way to capture that public realm? In this particular design, the students also wanted to support the location across from the engineering building and use it as the parklet as a moment of ecological research in bioswale design, so that it actually would have testing and monitoring embedded within it as well. They too were dealing with issues of illumination embedded in it to extend it into the nighttime. You can see here in this section, right, where we're starting to see the moments where they're sort of dealing with the bioswale. Here's a food cart. Here's somebody happily drinking their food cart product, right, and then coming and hanging out. And that would be a moving car, because this is where a parked car would have been. And they're doing things like thinking carefully about seat assembly and material allocation, how to make this thing stable, but also profiles are cut in a way to resist damage and wear and tear. They're thinking carefully about the planting, and you can see more sort of deliberate study of how they're going to turn this into a bioswale, right, and what materials they're going to be choosing. The final project, also the food cart, but very different in nature. They called it Project Rickshaw, because the unique thing here is they wanted it to be mobile, to provide a different service and value. And here, I'm just checking out both of them. So the top one, you see it in its mobile configuration, and the bottom one, you see it in its stationary configuration. So what that meant was actually one parklet, right? So here's a parking space, because here's in plan a car driving by for scale, would actually be made up of 3 separate rickshaws that, when stationary, would appear as one larger platform, but then, when made mobile, would be a smaller cart. So you see them here, sort of, here's the 3 rickshaws. They developed a manner of joining them together that was sort of seamless, so that you can put any rickshaw together next to any other one. They also developed a way of allowing people to transform what you wanted to happen. So if I'm there by myself and somebody else is there by myself and we don't want to talk to each other because we're strangers, you can fold up the bench and up these counters and sit back to back with a stranger. The opposite version of that is you go with a group of friends, and then this moves down. There's ones on the sides that flip up so that you can sit face to face and talk to each other. Or in this case, this version is, the seating has been folded down, and the only thing that's up is the bar if you want to do sort of more the standing version of eating and talking. So this is what happens when 3 rickshaws are put together as a parklet. But this is what they look like when they start to become mobile. They have a canopy top that is included with each individual unit that is locked into, that has their sort of locker and storage space embedded where you saw benches and other things. And then those sort of fold up. You can put the canopy up. The benches all fold up. They design security measures so these things don't roll away. And design the handlebars to telescope so that they would be at a 45-degree angle when you're carrying it. Also chose aluminum as their material of choice so that it would be lightweight and able for a single person to move it from space to space. And again, all those benches and shelving that you saw moving up and down then become the counters where if I'm preparing food, right, like a mini food cart, becomes that service area. So here you can see, again, it being deployed at night. And again, there were attention to lighting up with a series of LED lights, countertops, places to sit. So whether in that district there is a summer movie night, right, that these things could be deployed to support that in the Halprin block park, but then also they could just sit day to day by the food carts. Their material palette obviously more different than the other two. Aluminum, while more expensive, was chosen because it was lightweight, but also because we provided SOMA with a plan to recoup that money, which is they could rent the rickshaws, right? That they would sit as public infrastructure on a day-to-day period. But if somebody's having a special event, you could rent a rickshaw and have it go to, and hopefully that would pay for the cost. They're also interested in using reclaimed vinyl for billboards, things like that, for the canopies and the other side pallets. So at the end of that project, we held an exhibition for the SOMA community. Again, primarily business owners. Very few people live in SOMA. The people who do tend to be the PSU students. Those are the main constituencies. And we got a lot of community feedback as well as buy-in to the project, which at this point was just an envisioning project itself. What was interesting about it is that we were really able to convince them on the issue of this being public, not private, of fixed infrastructure as opposed to temporary, even though these are all business owners who just saw it as a way to provide more seating. And that there wouldn't be explicit ownership, that they would be quote-unquote owned and maintained by SOMA itself. Right, so that they wouldn't become proprietary, and then therefore you could kick people out if they were considered undesirable by a specific business owner. The city had an April 1st deadline for what they call street seats, which is their regulatory version of parklets. We submitted this. The city told us that we were the only public submission, that all of the other submissions were private, meaning a specific business trying to extend their seating. That a lot of them were this sort of temporary, just tables and chairs they already own that they want to put on them, and that primarily all of the rest of the submissions were only in 2 neighborhoods, either Pearl District or sort of the inner east side, which is sort of hipster Portland, right? Or sort of the locations. So we feel pretty confident that we are going to get approved, given that we're the only public one, and we're also the only one in this neighborhood outside of those 2 districts. So given that, we are already making plans. We're starting to raise the money for this particular project for the first one so that we would have a class where students would when I say design build, obviously the design portion has been taken care of. We'll design the details more for constructability and then build it in the fall, assuming June 1st is the deadline when they'll tell us. So I'll just really quickly, so in the package that we put together for the city, we took the feedback that we got, right? So we just didn't say, this is our vision, what is it that you want, once we convinced them of the public buy-in. And they said, well, we really like and these are the food carts and plan, we really like the food cart location, but we like the one that you did up near the apartment building. So we worked with them on modifying that scheme. It takes 2 parking spaces. You can sort of see there's a higher bar area with fixed bar stool seating. Then there's sort of this little U-shaped area with high back seating where you can sit with friends and in a group and face and talk to each other. And then this is seated for people who want to sit and maybe have their laptops or work again, but not necessarily facing each other so that you can sit with strangers. We estimated that you could probably get, if everyone's willing to sit and share that public space, 28 people sitting in on any given time. And then we also included, which you'll see in a second, ways of dealing with water runoff. So here you can see the material palette as it's been revived a little bit. We got a consult with a landscape architect to talk about native plants as a transplant from the East Coast, not as familiar with the flora and fauna out here. That is what is providing actually the back seating, so it's not just a wall, but actually they're sitting against a wall that ends up being a planter, which is helping deal and manage with the water runoff. The other thing the city said to us is we were the only ones who talked about that issue whatsoever. Most of the parklets that were proposed, once they saw ours, they realized they needed to go back to them, because what happens, and 4th Street goes downhill in this direction, is in the other plans, it's just a flat platform, which means if it rains, which we know it will, that you would get pooling in this parking space over here of water. So the students designed a channel to allow water, which you can see here in sort of the detail, to move through the parklet to help manage that. And then obviously we still have the canopy that's also going to funnel water into those planter areas. And here you can see the Rebar. So here's the food carts. Here's the parklet right here. And there as well. So the reinvention of cities globally is happening in places left over and left behind by star architects and investors, and their focus on skyscrapers, museums, and shopping centers. In other words, is it really the Bilbao effect, or is it the Bilbao anomaly, right? That worked in a very specific situation and time, but maybe what we need to be paying attention to are the people who are reinventing cities that deal with infrastructure that is being neglected. And often these ideas come out of either forgotten needs and desires or sometimes extreme circumstances. The Right to Dream project in Portland is an example of that, which is a safe place for homeless to sleep at night without being disturbed by police, private security, or being threatened with violence, right? So that they actually have a secure place where they can get 8 hours of sleep, which is one of the huge things that you need if you're trying to get a job. The challenge to Daniel Burnham, articulated by former Mayor Jaime Lerner, is based on a notion that cities have become too complex to be governed and planned solely from a centralized located city hall. Successful urban politics today are largely based on temporary alliances created for the solution of very specific concrete challenges. The Brooklyn streetscape spot, which is in southeast Portland, is a great example of that. Skater kids were just occupying this public right-of-way that was alongside a rail yard and some light industrial businesses. The businesses were initially unhappy with them, kept trying to chase them off. So this is when I'm talking about sort of temporary alliances, which are often creative ones. They actually developed an alliance with the local beat cop who would walk through there. And they're like, hey man, we're just trying to find a place to do our thing, right? So the beat cop worked with them and talking to the business owner saying, look, their activity is actually a positive occupation of public space instead of sort of crime and drugs and gang activity. So then with this cop, they started trying to raise money. Some of the businesses saw that actually there was positive value in the reclamation of this public right-of-way by these teenagers. They were able to get some buy-in from them, and they designed and built this thing all on their own with this alliance that initially were like, get the hell out of our space, right? But a police officer, some of the businesses who did start to support them, and then eventually they all turned the mind around of the railway yard that's on the other side of this, and got the city to make it official. When we're talking about these temporary alliances, this is a good example as well. I wrote up here, partnerships of shared responsibility between citizens, professionals, politicians, and the economy are what's thriving in contingent urbanism. Some people in New York's planning department, right, who are planning out bike lanes to make the city a better place to be, we're coming into conflict with these folks who are activists who just spray paint on the street where they think bike lanes should be. And what the planners realized at first, sort of they were going back and painting over all of these, right, because they're illegal. Somebody in the office finally said, we should pay attention to this because these are the bikers. And they might know something about where it's more advantageous for bikers to have bike lanes. And so what's interesting is they started mapping where these were showing up and adjusted their plans accordingly. Right? The official powers that be, who had designed this from on high, started paying attention to this tactical mapping of the city, saying, well, the bikers probably know something about where they want bike lanes and why, and so we're going to start mapping their interventions. These tactical relationships, this is sort of my favorite. I know we're sort of running on time, so I'll be very brief about her. She was a Hollywood stunt woman, dockyard worker, and a wardrobe mistress. And at the age of 63, decided to start a garden in the lot next door to her house, which had been basically where people would dump their trash, right, in an unofficial manner. So it was full of all sorts of trash. She would look out her kitchen window and see it, and she started this in the 1960s. I don't see my exact date. So she doesn't tell the city anything. She basically makes a big mound of trash, gathers everything into one concentrated place and sets it on fire. Now, this is where, how much is truth and how much is lore and legend, but when you investigate this and ask the current trust in charge of these gardens, it's claimed that the trash burned for 3 days solid. That's how much trash was in this lot. So she starts there just trying to make a garden that can be useful for everyone. Well, because she's tactical, her garden encroached on some other property owners. Long story short, more than once, that those property owners would say, hey, I'm going to build something, so your garden is going to be, see you later. And every time she was able to rally the community to the point where by 2006, when another sort of tactical parcel that she was partially built on, they were able to raise $1 million to protect the parcels, buy all of the land, and donate it into a local land trust. So again, this is this trajectory from the tactical. A woman who looked out her kitchen window and saw a bunch of trash in the lot next door, burned it. It was very illegal. And now this is it started as a 2-acre park. It's now over multiple acres. It's protected by the city of San Francisco. So for whom and by whom is this type of urbanism being instigated? Are there people still being left out of these processes? And the final point is, just because it's contingent urbanism and it comes from the people doesn't mean that it should be claimed to be good, right? That it's naturalized as such. The final example I want to share with you is the Tower of David, a 45-story office building that was never finished. It was, started in the 1990s. It was meant to be Latin America's third tallest skyscraper and sort of this symbol of global commerce and capitalism in Venezuela. In 2007, squatters started moving in, so there's a long period of its dormancy. Over 2,500 people now live on 28 of the 45 floors. The residents have opened businesses. There's an unlicensed dentist. There's a whole bunch of bodegas. There's a couple of churches. There's a beauty parlor. Again, all in this unfinished tower. The tower is maintained by the squatters at their own cost, which means there's a lot of inequity even within that. Some people have, flat screen TVs and stunning views, and other people, are just living in sleeping bags, in these unfinished apartment buildings. So it's providing a refuge for the homeless, but at what cost? The condition of the building is fatally hazardous. This is an unfinished building that was unfinished in the 1990s. When you're talking about today, that infrastructure that was unfinished has even deteriorated more. There's never been any running water, right? We're talking about 28 floors of these 45 are occupied. There's no running water. There is no sewer. There are no windows. So the threat, because of the unsanitary conditions, they've actually had multiple outbreaks of dengue fever. There are no guardrails, and because there's no facades, more than one young child has fallen to their death. All right, I say this not to bum us out, but to remember that just because it's contingent urbanism doesn't mean that automatically it's good. And even when it's contingent urbanism, these are still people living in desperate situations or trying to ameliorate needs that are not being provided from the top down. And their solutions still may not be good solutions, right? And these are things that we can learn from. So I'll end with these two quotes. I like them because I think sometimes, I started by saying, well, architecture is not just about buildings, but architecture is about people. And so to end, I would say that, yes, those of us who work in the field of architecture, we build buildings. But I think it's more important to build in the world of ideas first. If we build in the world of ideas, then we will have more success in managing change and stewarding that change in our built environment. Thank you. So I know it's late, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
contingent suburbanism, because when you talk about neglect, I feel like that's even more.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that, because the other sort of main project I've been working on, it's called East of 205. We just did an exhibit actually down at Mercy Corps for it, is where, so when Philip was very generous in sort of running through the litany of my past, I'm interested in adaptive reuse, but primarily right now I'm interested in the adaptive reuse of suburban morphologies. And what's happening in these neighborhoods where there's been this disinvestment of this 1950s, 60s, 70s, sometimes 80s infrastructures that are all suburban morphologies, even when they're within the city. And Portland is a prime example of that. In the studio I'm running now, the students are, right now, they just finished their sort of mapping and research on what resources this particular neighborhood is lacking, and they're lacking everything. They don't have recreation centers, they don't have public libraries, they don't have parks, they don't have any of this stuff. And they're going to be doing, and they've also mapped all the vacant spaces in these strip malls, and they're going to be doing adaptive reuse proposals of this. So you're absolutely right. This work is happening in suburbia, but I think it's not as strong as a foothold, because somehow, you know, the city is a stronger icon that people can sort of hold on to or understand. It's harder to understand the disinvestment of suburbia, even though we know that it happened in the past decade pretty extremely. Yeah.
Have you looked into Christiana in Copenhagen?
No.
Oh, it's cool. It goes back to the 1970s, where a whole group of people took over a former military facility and actively used railroad carts and built houses and tore up the concrete and greened it over, and it's been going on for 40 years. There's a book that came out on it. If I can find my copy, I'll tell you about it. But it's worth Googling. I'm sure you can find it. Christiana in Copenhagen.
Yeah, I'd love to look at it. I mean, obviously my research is primarily based in North America, or the Americas, but you know, I think given sort of the social agendas of Europe, that a lot of this stuff has been happening there as well. Obviously, I started with the Les Bouganistes, and I think it's unmined in terms of people doing some serious research and sort of mapping it in a holistic way that we can really sort of learn from.
Well, they have art schools there, and they have free boxes, and there's a lot of street sales, and they consider themselves a separate polity within the government there. It's being contested right now because developers would like to take over that site, but I think it's something worth using as a foil for what's going on here.
Yeah, no, that's a great suggestion. Great thing about presenter notes is that
I have a last question. Is it, when we see kind of guerrilla or small scale or grassroots these activities popping up, and even kind of squatters in these buildings, is it more an indicator of a lack of public infrastructure, or more an indicator of social engagement, people kind of willing to engage in their community?
I think it's a little bit of both, and obviously it depends on the nature of the activity, but I think it is people identifying some type of disinvestment and finally sort of having it up to here with that disinvestment, but then it also shows their ability to sort of build that social capital around that disinvestment. So it sort of depends on which way you're coming at it. If it's sort of hyper-locally based, usually it's that vacant, I love her, the dock worker, right, Grace Marchant, spent years looking at that empty lot full of trash and finally had it one day and just decided to do something on her own, right? So that's one version of it. The other version are those bicycle activists, right, who came together as a group first, who were sort of, as a group, came together over what I would call the mythologies of Portland as a sustainable city. Not that they don't have important initiatives, but I think a lot of stuff gets whitewashed. So that was sort of their coming together. And then after they came together, started to engage in rewilding and this guerrilla gardening. So I think it sort of depends. I think when it's very situational in terms of the physical place, often it's one or two people who are doing it, and then they mobilize the social capital, but then the social capital can come first, and then they are seeking out situations to highlight. So I think it depends on the group.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank